Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I hope everybody's doing okay. I'm thinking about you and your families and hope everybody is just doing okay. So we're going to cruise to the Renaissance and we're going to answer two questions in this video. What factors caused the Renaissance's roots in Italy? And we're going to add to that a little bit about the Renaissance in Florence and how was the Northern Renaissance different from the Italian Renaissance? So these are actually two big questions. We're just going to look at some of the key aspects of this topic. So why Italy? And this goes back to that Burckhardt versus Thorndike debate when we looked in class, is it really the case that the Renaissance just pops up in Italy, without any kind of context to it? Italians just kind of wake up one morning and, likely that's not the case. This has been brewing for a while in the Middle Ages. And if we do kind of buy into the idea that the Renaissance is something significant in terms of this new intellectual culture, what is it that creates that? Well, some historians would, if you happen to be on the Burckhardt side and you argue, Italy actually has some unique context pieces that make it kind of a spot for some of this intellectual activity. There's a couple different reasons for that. And one, of course, is that, these ruins of Rome are right in the backyard of Italians, right? They are very linked to the classical culture, especially they see themselves as heirs of Rome. There's a great deal of manuscripts, including Greek manuscripts that are in Rome, either brought by Christian scholars who are come to study in Rome. There's also a great deal of Christian Byzantines who came during the time that the Byzantine Empire was attacked by the Ottoman Empire, and so, or before that, the Seljuk Turks. So there's a great deal of texts that are accessible. That might be notable and significant. There's a growing merchant class, something we know from all of the trade conversations, and also there's some economic, wealth that perhaps gets created in the post-plague era, in the long run after the plague. There's a couple of other things about Italy that are unique because of the nature of the city-states, which have very specific political systems. There's also, all kinds of interesting things with the judicial systems and a variety of institutional things that change in these city-states kind of over time during the Renaissance. But there is this kind of budding wealth that really comes in a couple of different forms. And in a lot of cases in Italy, you still have noble families. These would be people who have some sort of royal blood or noble blood, and perhaps they, had a bloodline to, somebody who was an estate owner and, had kind of a noble title. They were a duke or something like that. Well, the nobles start to compete with a new class, which is really the merchant class. And Italy's city-states tend to see extraordinarily high growth of the merchant class. Part of that's due to the trade and Italy's geography, but we see in Venice and we see in Florence and we see in Milan two types of activity that relate to merchants. One is production, and the other is a lot of banking and finance and kind of ways in which the entire commerce of the society is going to develop. And to give us an example of that, we can look at the Medici family. It's a merchant family that exists in Florence. They kind of represent, really like this new wealth, right? They're not nobles. They're not born into power. Giovanni de' Medici is somebody who kind of crafts this family business in banking. It starts real small and they take some really risky loans, but ultimately they start to make money off of loaning and funding, some people's ideas, their plans and whatnot, and they end up getting paid back that interest that bankers make, and this becomes very much, their growth mechanism. They're going to be a banking family that's going to grow and grow. They'll have branch offices throughout Florence, but also outside of Italy, even into other areas of Europe. They are certainly not the only family. There's many, many families. Even within Florence, there's different quarters of the city and families that control each of those quarters. And the Medici are kind of relegated to their particular quarter at first, and they become a growing, budding family. but they do establish some degree of aristocracy. And at the time that Giovanni and his son Cosimo come to power, when I say come to power, it's very, very unofficial initially. There's a great deal of, kind of sentiment that individuals who get to vote might be people who are nobles or who have certain types of occupations. Maybe a couple thousand people in Florence get to vote, and people who are eligible for political office essentially put their name in a hat, and people are picked from that hat. But there's a lot of people, of course, tens of thousands of people that can't vote, so the entire system is kind of a little bit of an interesting system. But within that system, which seems like somewhat Republican of sorts, is a behind-the-scenes pulling of the strings, and the Medici family gets involved in Florence that way. And Florence, by the way, creates most of its wealth through textiles and wool. It becomes a productive hub, and it's significant because Florence as a city-state prior to the Renaissance is like a nothing place. It is not significant in the Roman Empire or significant earlier. So you kind of can take like, why is it that Florence as this city-state starts to develop? And one answer might be certainly some of the activities that the Medici family took. So this Medici family that's kind of behind the scenes in some of the political system in Florence, and is also creating greater and greater wealth, has a few things going on. There is some pushback, just like we saw in like Confucian China, against merchants. In the case of the Medici family, the Christian church is not a huge fan of something called usury. This is the idea of making interest. They look at bankers. The Christian church might look at bankers as people who aren't necessarily making anything. They're not using their hands. They're actually just charging money to loan other people money, and that's seen as something that is not religiously genuine. In fact, in Dante's Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, the seventh circle of hell is dedicated to people who are the rich merchants and who make money off of banking. And the punishment that Dante gives them, because he gives everybody in hell, a punishment that is matching the crime, he has them constantly moving their hands. They always are constantly moving their hands. They can't stop, because in real life, they never use their hands. So this is like a no-no. And arguably, the Medici family is taking a great deal of their wealth and contributing it to the church and contributing it to the community and kind of playing this societal role, because they are mitigating some of what could be issues for them of salvation. It's the context of the time. The Christian church has a significant role, and in the family of the Medici also. So there is a lot of giving to the church and a lot of control of the church. They're essentially buying an indulgence to go to heaven. They also are interested in beautifying the city. So there's a great deal of, this is kind of the House of Medici. It's like a block long. It has all of these windows. It's massive. This is this huge kind of space. This artwork by Donatello, which fairly early on in the Renaissance, so in the time period of like maybe the earlier kind of reign of the Medici family, you could see some of this artwork if you looked through the window. And this Donatello, sculpture of David is kind of very symbolic to Florence. Florence is like an up-and-coming underdog city. David, in the story of David and Goliath, he kills a giant. It's kind of an up-and-comer, type of thing. There's also an interest of a lot of power over other families. So the Medici family has a great deal of conflicts, and perhaps some of this ways of building wealth to, build chapels and invest in art. A lot of that is to display power over other families, perhaps even other city-states. It's also a display of status. And we know Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo, who is significant in the 1400s, he is somebody who is an intellectual and is really an interested person in the art. This is a painting that hangs in that very large palace of the Medici family, and it just kind of speaks to the way art changes a little bit in the Italian Renaissance. This is like the Medici family, and this is Cosimo Medici, and this would be his palace, and he is here on his horse, and he's kind of giving the space here to his his grandson, who's like the next in the reign of the Medici, kind of the next token person. And there is an idea here. This entire painting is designed to be like a parade of the Magi. So they're seen as being good to the church, similar to the way biblical stories tell of that. This is also built by Brunelleschi, somebody who was really quite a genius in terms of architecture and building, using a great deal of classical types of influence. This is one of the chapels that the Medici build, and it's massive, right? So it speaks to this like over the top kind of wealth, and churches in this time period never had chairs and seating. People went to church and stood. So when they're massive like this, people would be crowded in here, kind of arm to arm. It would be a massively crowded space, and that's something that's kind of created in this wealth of the Medici family. So just going to mention a couple of names of a few people who are perhaps also in this world of Italy, who are significant in the Renaissance. And I know that there's many, right? So, Leonardo, Machiavelli, it's impossible to speak about all of them, which is why we kind of did the project where you got a chance to pick. This way you're kind of looking at your peers who are talking about some of these, but a few that you should be familiar with. Dante, who's really a Middle Ages writer, is really significant in writing the Divine Comedy, which is very much, takes people on this trip, kind of throughout hell. His significance in Florence is kind of interesting, without getting into a lot of the political issues and the relationship between the political system and the Catholic Church and the way people see the Pope and whatever. He's exiled from Florence at one point in time, but there is a great deal of initiative he has in writing, not only in what he says, but also in his use of language. There's a great deal of emphasis on the Italian vernacular, and his kind of use of Italian kind of solidifies it as a spoken language. We also addressed Francesco Petrarca, the father of humanism, Will the Good, some of that, and his love for Laura. I'm not going to go into that too much. I'm just going to quickly mention the Domo and Filippo Brunelleschi, who's really working for the Medici family. He's hired through a contest at one point to see if he could actually build this dome that you see in the picture on the top of a large cathedral in Florence, and for years it has no dome. It's just an open cathedral with space, and everybody on the inside can't use it until Brunelleschi builds the dome. And the dome is very difficult to imagine. At the time there's nothing quite like it, and so Brunelleschi actually uses an egg, cracks the egg to show how something like this could actually stand. And he was not easy to get along with, but does have an incredible skill in math and engineering. He builds gears and puts hundreds of people to work on this project. And if you visit Florence today, you can still see the Duomo. Castiglione, he's much later in the Italian Renaissance in 1528. His particular work is almost like a how-to guide of being a Renaissance gentleman. So this is kind of designed for those people like the Medici family and the individuals like them, these rich merchants who are now out there. What is it that they are really able to do, and he gives a description of how they should be refined, and he kind of frames, in a sense, what we today would call the Renaissance men, that there should be a variety of different disciplines that people excel at. They choose wisdom, and they practice with art and painting, and they might read certain books, but they also might, fight a certain way. So there's a great deal of skill and talent that's emphasized, but the talents aren't just single talents. There's a great deal of exceptionalism in everything that is kind of like applauded in particular. And so this idea of what we might recognize as genius and whatnot becomes popular in the Italian Renaissance. There's perhaps another perspective on the Italian Renaissance, and not only is it, in art and maybe in, realism, naturalism, some of that in art, we also see some of